time for us to start. I see Jason is recording it. So officially, welcome everybody. We've been chatting a little bit ahead of time. We'll fill you in later. Welcome to our webinar, our May webinar. I want especially to thank our webmaster, Jason Smith. I don't think I thanked him last week, but last month, he is fabulous. He's been getting everything going and making it run smoothly. He's been recording it, so it will go on the Historical Society YouTube channel. So we're really just awfully glad to have him. Those of you who have not attended before, I will tell you down at the bottom of your screen somewhere, there is a button that says chat, and I think one that says Q&A. So if you all have any questions or comments during Jackie's presentation, just type them in, and I'm going to be making a note of them so that at the end she can address your questions. The program will be on our YouTube station within a couple of days, which you can access from our website, which is www.norfolkhistorical.org. All lowercase, all strung together, norfolkhistorical.org. And if you have any comments, we would love to have them. I am going to introduce our speaker now, Jackie Spainhour. Jackie is the director of the Hunter House Victorian Museum in downtown Norfolk. It seemed like such a great tie-in to last month's program with Greg Rutledge talking about the West Freemason Street District, and he even featured the Hunter House in one of his slides. So now we're going to get to go inside and behind the scenes of the Hunter House to learn a little bit about the Hunter family, what Norfolk was like, and Jackie even has a link to a virtual tour that she will share at the end, where you can actually take a tour yourself before you go there in person. Jackie is a writer, researcher, museum professional, and a special needs mom. She lives in Norfolk. She was recently honored as a 40 under 40 recipient from her alma mater, Old Dominion University, right down the road. She sits on the board of directors for the Victorian Society in America. She has several books that she has published, including a history lover's guide to Norfolk that's brand new. It was just released 2 days ago on May 10th. So maybe she'll tell us a little about that, or maybe not. We'll have her back to talk about that. She's also published Museums and Millennials, Engaging the Coveted Patron Generation, and Gilded Age of Norfolk, Virginia, Tidewater Wealth, Industry, and Propriety from 2015. She's president of the Southampton Roads Museum Forum, chair of the VSA Book Awards Committee, and copy editor for the VSA's peer-reviewed journal, 19th Century. Lifelong lover of museums, she found her dream job, I think, as director of the Hunter House Museum, where she has served since 2015. So now I will turn it over to Jackie. It's yours.
Awesome. Great. Okay. I want to make sure that you all are seeing what I'm seeing. Do you see the PowerPoint? Peggy, wave your hand if you can see the PowerPoint.
I see it. I see it.
Perfect. Just want to double check. So thank you all so much for having me. Peggy, that was a great introduction to a little bit of my background. And I do have a copy of our new book. Peggy actually wrote the introduction for that. So I will show you all that at the end. And when my PowerPoint is over, as she suggested, I will drop a link to a virtual tour of the museum. It's one of those 3D drag and view tours. It's only on the second floor right now. And it's something that we use when we have guests that come that are unable to make it up the stairs. So it's one of our ADA compliance things that we try to do. So without further ado, I did write this out because I have a tendency to talk a lot. So I'm going to, for the sake of time, read this to you. Please ask any questions or have any comments about this. Please give them to Peggy. I'm more than happy to answer those for you, and I hope that I can. An old adage states, along with great power comes great responsibility. For families of the Gilded Age, including those in Norfolk, this meant not only economic responsibility to aid the needy, but also social responsibility to guide the morality and the structure of each class in the communal hierarchy. In this respect, the wives and daughters of prominent men found their calling in life. These women can be categorized as trendsetters, popular, and the like, but their classification as such was as much a burden as it was a blessing. They were held to the highest standards, and with that came very specific obligations. First and foremost was to determine the social hierarchy in their local communities, and their weapon was the calling card. The calling cards you see here are actually of Eloise Dexter Hunter and Harriet Cornelia Hunter, the Hunter sisters who made the museum possible. Calling cards determined a lady's social status depending upon how they were received and returned by the highest ranked ladies of leisure. If private calls were made in person and the fashionable ladies did not return in kind, the caller was made well aware of her social standing in the community. Of course, calling and other social customs were meant to be based upon wealth and prestige, but with the rise in industry and overnight new money families, old Southern belles often found themselves in a very precarious position. With the system of old money, it was a family's name and honor that guaranteed its rank in society. However, with the addition of newly wealthy families without that history of land ownership and affluence, notable ladies in Norfolk and other southern areas watched helplessly as their social customs were subjected to scrutiny. The women of these newly wealthy families insisted that they deserved to be placed within the ranks of these noble women, and many expected to be placed in the top tier among them. By using the calling cards in their special language, these old money ladies of the South could ensure that these new money women knew their places. In most cases, upward social mobility would have to be earned, and at great expense to the often snubbed wives and daughters of these industrial tycoons. Social propriety could be measured by social outings like balls and dinners, which Peggy had talked about Lafayette before you all got on here, and by one's involvement in charitable organizations. The wealthiest women founded homes for the indigent or schools for the blind, often with their husband's money. The easiest method for women in Norfolk to check this box on their cultural resume was to become involved in long established charitable organizations, many with genealogical and religious ties. Among those with chapters in Norfolk were the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the Confederacy, the Huguenot Society, and others. While men were busily at work within the walls of the various architectural triumphs of the city, many women were tying their family names to the virtues of charity and modesty. At once, men were the builders while women were the nurturers. There was never a time in Norfolk's history where involvement in this well oiled machine was greater than during the Gilded Age. By the turn of the century, Norfolk became quite prosperous, both economically and socially. In November of 1890, a writer for the New York publication Journal of Commerce challenged his readers to find a more prosperous place in Virginia. He stated, "If any man knows of one gift with which nature has more richly endowed her than Virginia, let him name it. Virginia is unsurpassed." This assertion was certainly correct. By 1900, Virginia had become a leading state in the production of raw goods, made major innovations in transportation, and expanded its connections to the military. There were newer, improved railway connections, expansions in maritime trade, and furthered networks to commercialism. In the years following Reconstruction, Norfolk's population had expanded nearly 60% to 40,000 inhabitants. The once small seaport town grew into a hub for railroads and for industry. And it's within this framework of industrialization that the patriarch of the family that this talk focuses on, James Wilson Hunter, decided to build his $20,000 family home in the most coveted area of downtown Norfolk. He had a history with Norfolk itself, starting his humble beginnings as a wholesale dry goods and notions clerk downtown. The business was located on what was then 42 and 44 Commerce Street and was properly known as J.W. and Company Dry Goods and Notions, a wholesale company. By 1894, Mr. Hunter had become profitable in retail, but he found even greater opportunity when he began to pursue a career in banking. Mr. Hunter joined the Bank of Commerce as its chief financial officer, a business then ranked as the third most profitable banking house in Norfolk. From 1903 to 1923, Mr. Hunter floated between various banking houses. He's recorded as serving as president of the Virginia Bank and Trust Company, which changed names many times while he was there until 1921. By 1920, he became chairman of the board of the Virginia National Bank and the Virginia Bank and Trust Company. His blossoming career coincided directly with the construction of the Hunter family home. As the economic sector began to expand in Norfolk, so did Mr. Hunter's personal wealth. By 1894, he had commissioned Bostonian architect William Pitt Wentworth to build his family a new home in the heart of the city, close to his prospering career and away from the more rural Princess Anne County in which he lived as a young man, which is now Virginia Beach today. Within a mere 1 year, the home was complete and the family moved in 1895. And you might recognize this facade if you've ever been into the Freemason Historic District and if you listened to last month's lecture. Born December 19th, 1850, James Wilson Hunter married 18-year-old Lizzie Eyre Barnes at St. Luke's Church in Norfolk in 1877 with, quote, consent of the lady's mother. You might be wondering why I put that in there. That's because we have a couple of different records. One that tells us they were married with consent and one that doesn't. They also had a child exactly 9 months after their wedding, so that could explain that, but we don't exactly have proof of that. On April 30th, 1878, the couple welcomed their first child and only son, James Wilson Hunter Jr., to their family. On October 10th of 1880, the family expanded to include Harriet Cornelia, followed by her sister, Eloise Dexter, on February 2nd of 1885. When the family moved into their new home on Freemason Street, the children were 9, 14, and 16 years old. None of the Hunter children ever married, and none of them had children of their own, and they all remained in the home throughout the duration of their lives. While residents in the home, the children were well educated and became very involved in their local community. Harriet and Eloise were both educated at Phillips and West School for Girls in Norfolk, where they were taught the subjects deemed appropriate for young ladies of their standing. They were regular attendees at Sunday service at nearby Christ and St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which still stands, both before those churches combined and afterwards. There was a fire that forced a combination. They were also very involved in genealogical and heritage-based organizations like Daughters of the Revolution and the Huguenot Society. They remained active in all of these organizations until their deaths in the mid-20th century. James Wilson Hunter Jr., though, experienced a very different life, as you can imagine, from Harriet and Eloise. James was educated at the Episcopal High School in Alexandria, Virginia, as a youth. When the family moved into the home, James was actually attending school. Following high school, James attended the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. There he received a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts, both in 1899. He also did more graduate work at the University of Virginia, and he graduated with his MD in 1901. He then attended Harvard, where he pursued his postgraduate education. And by 1901, he became a certified doctor and was categorized as a general practitioner, a cardiologist, and a radiologist. James continued his blossoming career under the guidance of this man, local Dr. Southgate Lee, whose family name might sound familiar to you. It is affiliated with the modern hospital, Centera Lee in Norfolk. Once he finished this period of professional guidance, Dr. Hunter opened his own practice in downtown Norfolk, where he remained for the majority of his life. His medical practice was only interrupted as World War I broke out and he joined the Army. By 1931, though, James Wilson Hunter had passed away. He was then followed by his wife, Lizzie Eyre Barnes, in 1940. And prior to her death that same year, James Wilson Hunter Jr. had suffered a heart attack and had passed away. James had been away in Hot Springs, Arkansas, making him the only family member who did not pass away in the house. All of the family members were laid out in the front parlor, as was custom, and then buried in Elmwood Cemetery. By the end of that same year, Harriet and Eloise became two sisters living alone in the big city. And this is what the interior of the museum looks like now. Since my virtual tour only encompasses the second floor, I wanted to show you a couple of places on the first floor. This is their front parlor, where they would have kept their best things and entertained. And this is their back parlor, where they would have spent more time as a family. During their lives, James Wilson Hunter and his son, Dr. James Wilson Hunter Jr., actively participated in social organizations for the male community. One of the most notable organizations that a man could be invited to join was Norfolk's infamous Virginia Club, which you see here. Men often joined occupational societies or philanthropic brotherhoods to further their family honor and hopefully their dominance within the community. The Ruritans, Freemasons, Shriners, and the like all witnessed the rise of chapter membership in Norfolk during this period. The creme de la creme of social belonging, though, came in the form of the Virginia Club. According to George Tucker, the Virginia Club is Norfolk's oldest male coterie. Its beginning dates from June of 1873, when a party of bon vivants met by chance one evening in the rooms of John Vermillion above Taylor's drugstore at Bank and Freemason Streets. The club itself occupied many different structures throughout its existence, the first of which was actually on 59 Main Street. A newer, more permanent location for the club was attained in 1888 at the corner of Plume and Granby Streets downtown. Due to a fire breaking out in the neighboring Atlantic Hotel in 1902, the Virginia Club was forced to move to a temporary location at the corner of Granby and Freemason Streets. Their club had been completely destroyed by the fire, and construction on a newer, permanent location was complete in 1904. The club moved again in 1916 to West Freemason Street due to financial constraints, and once more in 1919 to a home in the Ghent neighborhood, across the main road and outside of downtown. In 1927, the club moved back into the Freemason district to West Butte Street, where it remained until the 1930s. The club continued to prosper for many decades. It still exists today, except now they take women. Some of its more notable members included men from the Whitehead, Taylor, Pinckney, Todd, Doyle, Rowland, Ward, Weston, Walk, Tucker, Hardy, and Chamberlain families, among many others. The club was very exclusive and it harbored an extensive set of rules for its members. Among these regulations were those concerning admission in the club, duties, and the recreational activities that were available to members within the walls of the clubhouse. The bylaws of the Virginia Club state that membership can only occur if a prospective member is elected by the governors of the ballot, proposed by one member, and seconded by another. Additionally, only prime adult men are allowed admittance, as there is a regulation against anyone under the age of 21. All members were also required to pay monthly dues, which, if they were not paid in a timely manner, would result in immediate termination of the person's membership. Furthermore, behavior while on the club's premises were also very highly regulated. Members were not allowed to give gratuity to servants of the club. They couldn't take any materials from the club's library, and they couldn't visit after hours. Rules concerning gaming were also quite interesting. Betting was not permitted, and neither was putting anything on credit in the gaming room. Article 1, Section 2 actually states in their bylaws, all players of cards shall, upon every day that they may play, deposit in a box kept for that purpose alone the sum of 10 cents. Billiards shall be paid for at the rate of 10 cents per game. Cards will be furnished at cost price with an addition of 25%, and the price of cards in all cases will invariably be cash. I like to bring this up because I think rules are made only when problems come up. So I think these were probably created because they were having issues with credit and gaming. Moreover, there's other restrictions that were placed on gaming in Article 1, Section 3. No game of any description shall be played on Sunday or Sunday nights, nor 2 games of billiards shall be played by gentlemen when others are waiting to play. The observance of these rules is a point of honor. Other rules concerning social propriety came from subsequent articles, such as outlawing the presence of dogs inside the clubhouse, which I found interesting, and ordering supper at an unreasonably late hour. Also, members were not allowed to sleep or lie down in the couches in the club, and they were not allowed to smoke in the reading room. They also adopted a you break it, you buy it philosophy with the valuables that were held within the club's walls. Despite these various restrictions, the Virginia Club continued to welcome new members, like the Hunters, for over 100 years, and its membership, like I said, continues to expand today. Wealthy businessmen and other prominent lawyers, doctors, and tradesmen were not really considered part of Norfolk's elite class unless they secured membership in groups like this, especially the Virginia Club. Norfolk's elite, like the Hunters, also participated in other various activities at the turn of the century. At the forefront were those which allow for innovative and provocative explorations of culture. Of all the leisurely activities available at the turn of the century, what you all are doing right now was the most popular, and that was listening to a lecture. Men and women alike attended lectures concerning a wide range of topics, generally given by area scholars. Of course, women were usually participants, not people who actually were giving the talks, but men were often actively involved in audience discussion. These lectures could be held at local universities, libraries, churches, public meeting halls. The 1894 directory, which is the year the Hunters moved into their home, actually lists Christ Church lecture room where they attended church as a very popular area for these types of lectures. Earlier areas such as the Lyceum downtown had also been built really for that purpose alone. Lectures, next to dinner and dancing, of course, remained one of the high points of Gilded Age leisure. According to resident Emma Blow Freeman Cook, in the turn of century society that the Hunters lived in, she says the three D's were taboo. Dress, domestics, and disease were not discussed in good society, and the mention of money was, quote, beyond the pale. This was certainly true, but outward displays of one's wealth were always in order, as we know. As a result, Norfolk's shopping areas were ripe with fine clothing stores, jewelers, and others. Paul Gale Greenwood Company Jewelers offered its ornamental services at the corner of Granby Street and City Hall Avenue downtown, while those opting for more exotic pastime could actually visit Norfolk's palatial Turkish baths. Still, others could continue to patronize local tailors and clothiers, such as the Woman's Store owned by Ames, Brownlee, and Hornthal. Those in need of pen and ink could visit the local stationery shop on Granby Street, Norfolk Stationery, which still exists today, just in a different location, the primary supplier of all things correspondence. The more adventurous lot could spend time at the city's roller skating rink at the corner of Tazewell Street during the winter months. And we brought that back. You can go to MacArthur Mall and go to their outdoor ice skating rink in the winter. For children, there was Mr. Triple's Candy Shop at the corner of Granby and Charlotte Streets. Norfolk's downtown district that the Hunters lived in offered something exciting and pleasurable for all of its residents. Now, they lived a very exciting life, and as you'll see in the virtual tour, if you choose to take it, they lived life to the fullest. They love to travel. They love genealogical societies, but unfortunately for them and everybody else in this time period, despite their best efforts, they ended up here. So all prominent men and women of Norfolk during the Gilded Age eventually ended up in the same place, which was the cemetery. Following their deaths, each member of the Hunter family was laid out in the front parlor, as was custom for a wake, followed by a funeral. All of the members of the family are actually buried locally in a Victorian Park cemetery called Elmwood Cemetery, pictured here. Recently added to the National Register of Historic Places, Elmwood Cemetery was built in 1853, and it stands as a beautiful example of the Victorian worldview on death, something that the Hunters surely would have shared. For the Victorians, death was simply another part of life. It was considered a rite of passage, something that every person must undergo in order to be at peace and be reunited with their Lord if they were Christian. As a result, their cemeteries are not these unkempt, unorganized lots that we saw earlier in the 18th century. They were actually a family destination. Victorian families often spent entire days in the cemetery, cleaning off the headstones and the footstones of their deceased family members and stopping to have a picnic lunch under the oak trees. And if you haven't been to Elmwood, I highly suggest doing it. They offer a number of guided tours and programs, and it's a beautiful place, especially now during coronavirus, to social distance and have a beautiful picnic under the trees. I was lucky and found some really fun foxes out there last year when the pandemic started. And there's really something genuinely romantic about Elmwood Cemetery. I mean, if you walk around, all around you, you see that death is portrayed as this gentle sleep. There's these small bed-like markers that are made of headstones and footstones that mark the numerous graves of small children who, of course, died young, but are now resting peacefully and eternally. Carvings in the stones designate symbols of slumber, beauty, guardianship, and throughout the cemetery, passersby can notice a variety of symbols, all of which share this sort of secret significance. Every flower, every angel, every icon has a meaning. In Elmwood, many symbols are prevalent amongst these Victorian grave sites. Lilies, for example, represent purity, while ivy symbolizes fidelity and eternity. Symbols for mourning include ferns, draperies on urns, and weeping willows. Tones of happiness are reflected in images of rebirth and resurrection, which are portrayed in the forms of flying angels, seashells, butterflies, and flying doves. Of course, there's also numerous examples of Christian iconography in the cemetery as well. You can find Bibles, Ark of the Covenant, rosaries, crosses, and crowns on crosses as well in Elmwood. Some of the more interesting figures in the cemetery are actually these that you see here. There are lots of mourning figures and angels. Like the other symbols, each of these images contains a message for the observer because this is really an outdoor museum. Mourning figures can be seen standing alone, clutching larger life-size crosses, or even prostrate on stormy, rocky shores. All of these representations are meant to conjure feelings of grief and loss. Angels, on the other hand, often have much more positive connotations. Guiding angels are portrayed with these upstretched arms. You can see the angel in the middle has an arm pointing upward. Guiding angels also point fingers upwards towards the heavenly afterlife. Guardian angels are often found with arms protectively wrapped around a tombstone, almost always for a small child. Recording angels are some of the most prevalent, depicted, writing the name of the deceased in this book of life. And this obviously represents the hope that of the impact of the person. They hope they would have made a mark on the world. Other symbols include those that are more exotic in nature or turn to the past for inspiration. You can see broken columns in the cemetery, which symbolizes that classical Greek and Roman culture and represents a life cut short. There's other odes to ominous deaths, including handshakes, upside down torches, hourglasses, and broken reeds. The obelisk, which is rooted in Egyptian ideas, obviously, of the pyramids, which symbolize eternity and afterlife, can also be found in Elmwood. These were commissioned by wealthier families, of course, more often than not, because they wanted to represent their societal dominance. And of course, you can find mausoleums within the park as well, which were reserved for the wealthiest of the wealthy. The Hunters did not have this. The Hunters are buried in Elmwood, but they did not have a mausoleum. They don't have these beautiful mourning angels. And that kind of shows you that they were more lower upper class or upper middle class society. They were a working class family. The Hunters have these much less ostentatious graves that are in the front wing of the cemetery. Their 5 headstones are tastefully decorated, as are many others in the cemetery. But what I found most interesting when we go out there, because we do go out there to lay flowers, and we do take actually children there to talk about iconography and to talk about the cemetery as an outdoor museum or park. The daughters and the way that they have their graves portrayed is what's most interesting to me, because this is what they chose to leave behind as their legacy. If you go see their graves, there's a marker between the 2 girls, Harriet and Eloise, that indicates that they were daughters of the American Revolution. So even in death, they were most concerned with writing their place in history as descendants of a founding family. They actually also did trace their lineage back to someone who came into Jamestown, and not the first landing, but a subsequent landing. And so they considered themselves a founding family, and they worked very hard to do that research to be able to prove that. So markers like what the Hunters have were also not uncommon. Victorians were proud of their associations with various organizations, and they often chose to have those immortalized at the graveside. There's symbols in Elmwood relating to others, such as Daughters of the Revolution. You can see a blind justice with scales would indicate someone who might be a lawyer. Bibles could indicate the grave of a minister. These 3 chain links would symbolize the Independent Order of Oddfellows, another fraternal organization like the Masons. And of course, there are symbols for groups like the Masons, elks, eagles, owls, redmen, moose, etc. So there's always a way to immortalize yourself in these places. But as we know, cemeteries were not created for the dead, but for the living, and Elmwood's definitely a representation of that. Victorians understood the importance of ensuring their legacies so they could be appreciated by visitors, and they included all of these symbols to leave their ancestors clues of what was important to them and their lives. The Hunter family, like many other Victorian families, indulged in these types of markers to indicate their achievements while they were on this earth. And now they're forever immortalized in Elmwood, and you can go visit them whenever you'd like. So that is my short discussion for you. And while I've only been able to sort of focus on certain aspects of Norfolk in the Gilded Age, there's so much more that you can learn about Norfolk. And I really hope that this has opened your eyes a little bit to what life was like, what society was like for people who lived at the turn of the century in Norfolk. And that's all from me. So I'm ready for questions and answers.
Well, I thank you. We haven't had anybody write in with the questions so far, but it's not too late. Does anybody have a question? I thought it was interesting when you talked about the genealogy, and George Tucker, he used to tell the story of Miss Harriet and Miss Eloise walking from their house to the Norfolk Public Library when it was over on Freemason Street. to
Yeah.
do genealogy. And apparently they had a cat and they brought the cat with them and the cat box with them, and they would spend the day.
They did have a cat. When they were
Uh-huh.
younger, they had bunnies too. They had, we have a photograph of Eloise at the foot of a door with a number of bunnies running around.
Oh, how sweet.
They did. They had bunnies. They had a cat. They were animal people for sure.
Okay. How old were the sisters when they died? Here's a question that just came in.
They both died in their late 70s. So they lived
Okay.
full lives.
And they died, you said, in mid-century, the 50s?
Yeah, so Harriet died in 1958 and Eloise died in 1965.
Okay.
They were alone in the house from 1940 onward. So they had almost 20 years together, alone in the house and late.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. One of the questions, hi, Christine. That's a very convoluted question, Christine.
Ah,
The answer, okay, Christine's question is how many times during the day did the sisters change their dress or outfit and why? This is a hard question to answer because the sisters lived through so many different fashion movements and time frames during their lives. When they were young girls, of course, being in the nursery, they would not have had so many outfit changes. They would only change if they needed to leave the nursery and come down and see their parents for time with them. When they were in their late teens, early 20s, and we're talking, 1900 to 1910, there would have been Edwardian fashion, obviously, and they would have had tea gowns. They would have had a day dress they would have worn during the day. They would have changed for bedtime. They would dress up for dinner. So they could have anywhere between 4 and 6 outfits a day, and that would continue through about 1930. And that's when things changed dramatically, obviously, with the depression and with changes in society. So they would have been unable to change quite so much, but they still would have certainly dressed for specific occasions and would have been dressed to receive guests in the house as well. And then, of course, they pass away when we get into the 50s and 60s. So fashion changed then as well. So very convoluted question, Christine, but that's probably the best I can answer for you. But I know you, so if I find more information, I'll let you know. Um,
another question. Did the sisters entertain in the house while they were living there?
they would have, yes, Carissa. And the amount of entertaining that they would have done would have had to have been small. So if you've ever been to the house, it's about 4,000 square feet. And that includes a full dirt basement. It's a 3-story Victorian townhome. And therefore their dining room is small. We know that their table could seat 8. It had 2 leaves, it could seat 8. So if they had a formal dinner, it never would have been more than that. Um, but by the time the girls were there entertaining on their own, we're talking, the 40s. I'm sure they would have been able to have some types of standing parties and things like that with the introduction of the cocktail in the 20s, as Lady Grantham would say. I'm sure that they entertained. Yes.
What about their financial circumstances? Another question that came in.
Um, as in how do you want me to answer that? As in how much did they make, or I can tell you that their house at the time when they had it built was about $20,000, which today would be like 1.2 million, I think.
Wow.
So it was expensive, and that was built, from the ground up within a year. The Over time, their finances changed. So the mother came into the marriage with money, actually, and with land. And so the land over time was sold off. They eventually, where the Hunter House is, there are neighboring properties. And over time, they purchased the properties next door. So there's what we call the White House on the corner. That's at the corner of Duke and Freemason. We still own that. We operate that as a charitable organization for it's a home for elderly indigent men. We have about 8 residents there right now. And then where our parking lot is, there used to be another structure, historic structure that we purchased, the family purchased, that burned in a fire. And then the house next door to that is now owned by an architectural firm, and we also owned that building as well. And over time, as financial circumstances changed, they needed to consolidate. These properties were rented out and sold off, and so now we only own the museum and the white home at the corner. So they started out very wealthy. They were able to expand, and that was not unheard of. If you know anything about Norfolk's Freemason district, there were many families that had, these row houses where the siblings would sort of move out next to each other. And while we don't know this for certain, we suspect that Mr. Hunter purchased these other properties so that his kids could eventually move out, get married, have their own families, be in this prime location. Of course, that never happened. They never married or had children.
Do we have any idea why none of them ever married? It's another question.
We get that question a lot. That's the number one question. So the skinny on that is that they did not leave us any personal anything. So the only personal documents we have are some postcards from travels, and we've tried to piece together what we can. We don't really know why they didn't marry. And it seems counterintuitive, but actually there were other families in the area at the time, including the Hill sisters in Old Town Portsmouth, who were sort of the same time period as them. There were 5 girls over there that never married. And we think it might have something to do with the fact that this was kind of like a transient, military community. And
Mm,
maybe that was sort of the problem there. Dr. Hunter doesn't seem to have had any beaux of any sort. Neither does Harriet, but there was a gentleman that wrote Eloise via postcard for a number of years and then sort of dropped off, and we didn't know why. And we finally got to the nitty gritty of that and found out that he had in fact married someone else.
oh,
So that's as far as we got with them. None of them seem to have ever had a very serious relationship, although Eloise had this extended friendship, I guess you'd call it, with this gentleman that just didn't result in anything.
she was such a cute little girl.
You know.
Here's another question. Besides gardening and genealogy you mentioned, did either of the sisters have any hobbies?
Yeah, they actually, so a couple of things. They had sort of the regular hobbies that many women did. They love to read, they love to do needlework, things like that. We have some examples in the house. Christine, I think you may have seen these of seashells that were made to look like flowers that they would put in the home. Other contemporary women to them also would have done things like order out hair jewelry, having hair wreaths, things in the house that were memorials. But as they got older in life, they seem to have really wanted to make their stamp on local society in sort of a powerful way. And we have this picture from the early 50s of both the girls on the doctor's wives board at DePaul Hospital. Now, their brother had worked there, not their husbands. They weren't married, but somehow they had pushed themselves onto the doctor's wives board. So if that tells you anything about their personalities, they were they're very interesting ladies, I can imagine. I would,
Wanted to be heard.
yeah, yeah.
Here's another question. Do you know if the dining room table ever left the house?
I don't believe that it did. It's a extremely huge piece. It's a custom piece that was actually made by the architect William Pitt Wentworth for the family, and that's something that
Ah,
architects would do sometimes. It's got these beautiful lion's paws on the bottom, and there's these lion faces that are carved into the side of the table. I do not believe that that piece ever left the house. Now the chairs did. The chairs left and were reupholstered, but I don't believe the table ever did.
did the sisters keep anything like a diary or write a memoir?
No.
No.
No, everything that we know about them has been through years and years of research of us trying to reconstruct their lives through their belongings, which has been very difficult. A long-term project that I personally would like to do is to reconstruct their interests through their reading materials. They have an
Oh,
extensive library that I think would tell us a lot about who they are. They appear to love to travel. We have their passports. And, at the time when they were younger and started traveling, passports were just written accounts of what someone looked like. And there is an account on one of Harriet's passports that one of her legs was a little bit longer than the other, which could also be a reason why she was never approached to as like a marriageable person.
uh,
That she had an impediment, so to speak, that might have just cause that not to happen. But no, we don't have any diaries. And I think there are a number of places of museums like us that are family houses where families chose to burn things that were super personal.
Mm-hmm.
The family of this home, the way that it's written in Eloise's will is that she wanted this to be a museum of decorative arts and architecture. And while I'm sure it started that way, of course, everybody wants to know about the family. So we've been doing our best to get that information to you as authentically as possible. But fortunately, no diaries.
And the brother, I guess, didn't leave anything.
No, he published a lot of things in journals as far as medical things. The only thing that I know James liked to do is he liked to write. He seemed to have been a huge fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and he wrote a number of poems for himself. And we have one, I think it's called An Ode to Old Virginia, that he wrote, that we have printed out, that we put out in the fall when we do our morning exhibit. So he seemed to have thought himself a writer. He might have been a little bit of a romantic.
Interesting. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Would you like to tell us a little bit about this virtual tour?
Yes, I'm trying to see if I can drop it. If I start screen sharing, okay. I'm going to stop my share, Peggy.
Okay. And I will say there will be a link on the Norfolk Historical Society website. That's norfolkhistorical.org. We'll have a link to the what Jackie is about to share with you.
Okay, so I just I put it in the chat box. It's this app.cloudpano.com link that you see there.
Okay.
And it's a 3D drag tour of the second floor of the house. There's little info marks in the rooms where you can sort of put your cursor over something and it will tell you about a specific thing. And that was made for us by one of our community advisory board members, Alexandra Whiteside, who did that for us. We were very excited to have it.
And that's just the second floor, right?
Just the second floor, yeah. And Peggy, here's our book.
Oh, there's our book.
It's a History Lover's Guide to Norfolk. It just released 2 days ago, and you can get it at Prince Books, you can get it at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. But this book project, what I loved about this project is that there's actually there's 9 or 10 authors on the project. All of us took a different chapter. So if you want to know about the Neon District, if you want to know about Ghent, downtown, military sites, all of those things are
cemeteries.
Yeah, cemeteries. All of that's in the book. So,
well, any other questions? Any other questions? I don't see any. Well, Jackie, we thank you very, very much. And those of you who tuned in a little earlier may have heard us talking about Norfolk during Union occupation. Jackie found a diary at ODU, and she has agreed later in the year perhaps to talk about Norfolk during Union occupation. So if any of you all have ideas about speakers too, we're always trying to find somebody to top the last one. So Jackie, thank you. It was so interesting. Just a really good glimpse of what Norfolk was like during the time the Hunters lived here. So we appreciate it and we thank you. Several people have said thank you. Thank you for your time and all of the information that you gave us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us.
Okay.
We're open. Come visit us. We're open.
Yes, they're open. They're open now. Open to visitors. So check their website. And what's your website?
It's hunterhousemuseum.org. And you can get all our up-to-date stuff. We're very active on social media. So Instagram, Facebook, etc. You can find us. Okay.
Jackie was saying earlier that they had to do something different with their teas, that they usually have tea and tea desserts and food, and they've been having tea to go, so you can actually get it boxed up to go with some information in the box. So very creative. Yes. And a good way to keep your doors open. So go visit the Hunter House and join us next month, June 9th. We will see you then. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Jackie.
You're welcome.
Good night.
You too.